Good afternoon. As part of our administration's efforts to increase transparency and introduce all of you to the policy experts who are leading the President's initiatives, we're joined today by Domestic Policy Advisor Susan Rice, who will be talking about the racial equity executive order that the President will be signing this afternoon. She's kindly offered to stick around and take some questions. I will, as usual, play the role of bad cop when it's time for her to go. So with that, I'll turn it over to Susan.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be back. Jen, thanks. The President has committed the whole of our government to advancing racial justice and equity for all Americans. I'm leading this effort out of the Domestic Policy Council. I've assembled a first-rate team to drive this agenda forward. We'll hold the federal government accountable for advancing equity for families across America. I have the support of every White House office and every agency in this work because, as President Biden has made clear, advancing equity is everybody's job. Tackling these challenges, though, is personal for me. I'm the descendant of immigrants from Jamaica and enslaved Americans. My grandparents and my parents are beneficiaries of the American dream, and so am I. My family's story is a remarkable one of the march towards greater equality and opportunity. But for too many American families, systemic racism and inequality in our economy, laws and institutions still put the American dream far out of reach. Today, the average Black family has just 1/10 the wealth of the average white family, while the gap between white and black in home ownership is now larger than it was in 1960. These long-standing inequities are compounded by the converging crises we face as a nation. Americans of color are being infected by and dying from COVID-19 at higher rates. 1 in 10 Black Americans and 1 in 11 Latino workers are currently unemployed. By some estimates, 40% of Black-owned businesses have been forced to close for good during the COVID crisis. Black and Latino families with children are twice as likely to be experiencing food insecurity during the pandemic as white families. And Black and Latino Americans are 2.8 times more likely to die of COVID-19. And for Native communities across the country, the overlapping economic and health crises have devastated tribal economies and healthcare systems. These are desperate times for so many Americans, and all Americans need urgent federal action to meet this moment. Today, President Biden will deliver a national address on his plans to advance racial justice and equity, starting with an equitable and inclusive recovery. President Biden will renew the federal government's commitment to making the American dream real for families across the nation by taking ambitious steps to redress inequality in our economy and expand opportunity for communities that have been left behind, including communities of color. His economic plans make historic investments in underserved communities and put equity at the heart of our recovery. His ambitious agenda builds on a legacy of Americans forging opportunity out of crisis. These aren't feel-good policies. The evidence is clear. Investing in equity is good for economic growth, and it creates jobs for all Americans. Economists have estimated that the U.S. economy has lost a staggering $16 trillion over the last 20 years because of discrimination against families of color. If we closed racial gaps in income and opportunity, these same economists have estimated we could add $5 trillion to the U.S. economy over the next 5 years and add over 6 million new jobs for all Americans. So building a more equitable economy is essential if Americans are going to compete and thrive in the 21st century. We've hit the ground running to embed equity throughout the administration. On day one, the President signed an executive order directing an unprecedented whole-of-government initiative to embed racial equity across federal policies, programs, and institutions. That starts with a review of policies and institutions to redress systemic racism where it exists and to advance equity where we aren't doing enough. Every agency will place equity at the core of their public engagement, their policy design and program delivery, to ensure that government resources are reaching Americans of color and all marginalized communities, rural, urban, disabled, LGBTQ+, religious minorities, and so many others. The President has put equity at the center of his response to the COVID-19 and economic crises. His executive orders signed last week deliver rent relief, student debt reprieve, and emergency food assistance to families across the country, helping all Americans, including Black and brown families who we know are being hit hardest by this crisis. And he took steps to make our broken immigration system more humane and secure. He restored the integrity of the census so that our constitutionally mandated accounting of every person in the United States is fair and inclusive. And even before taking office, President Biden released his American Rescue Plan that will make historic investments in advancing equity. Independent economists estimate that his plan will cut child poverty in half. Cut child poverty in half for all Americans and reduce overall poverty by 30%. Black American families this year will face a poverty rate of 20% if Congress does not act on the American Rescue Plan. But if enacted, the poverty rate would fall by over 1/3, and it'd fall by 40% for Latino families and by 1/5 for Asian American and Pacific Islander families. The American Rescue Plan also provides critical relief to Native American communities and tribes. These investments will lift over 8 million Black, Latino, and Asian Americans out of poverty and provide relief across sectors where families of color are most disproportionately impacted by this crisis, in food and financial security, healthcare access, and education and child care. Today, President Biden is continuing his commitment to embedding equity at the center of his agenda by signing an additional package of executive actions. The President will sign a memorandum directing the Department of Housing and Urban Development to mitigate racial bias in housing and affirmatively advance our nation's fair housing laws. He will also sign an executive order directing the Department of Justice not to renew any contracts with private prisons. Private prisons profiteer off of federal prisoners and are proven to be, or found to be by the Department of Justice Inspector General, to be less safe for correctional officers and for prisoners. President Biden is committed to reducing mass incarceration while making our communities safer. That starts with ending the federal government's reliance on private prisons. The President will also sign an executive order reinvigorating the commitment of all federal agencies to engage in regular, robust, and meaningful consultation with tribal governments. And the President will sign a memorandum directing all federal agencies to take steps to combat xenophobia and acts of violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who have been targeted by political leaders in our nation's response to COVID-19. Again, these are continuation of our initial steps to advance racial justice and equity through early executive action. Beyond this, the President is committed to working with Congress to advance equity in our economy, our criminal justice systems, our healthcare systems, and in our schools. As I've said many times in my personal capacity, and I'll say again, I believe we all rise or fall together. Advancing equity is a critical part of healing and of restoring unity in our nation. The President will have more to say about all of this later this afternoon, and I'm happy to take a few of your questions.
Peter?
Ambassador Rice, thank you. You speak about communities of color right now that are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, of course. They're also less inclined to have faith in the federal government response to the vaccination process. So what specifically, I'll follow up with others, but what specifically is being done right now for communities of color to convince them it's okay to get this vaccine?
Well, Peter, I will leave much of this to my colleague Jeff Zients, who's leading our COVID response, but I think two important points. One, we have established within our COVID task force an effort on equity, and that includes obviously racial equity, that will focus on health disparities, but also on the reality that there are Americans who, and particularly Americans of color, who, for very valid historical reasons, are skeptical and reluctant. And a large part of what our colleagues on the COVID task force are doing, this is the second part, is reaching out directly through targeted campaigns to get to those very communities where the skepticism is highest. And that's vitally important because as communities of color are suffering disproportionately, may have less access to information about the vaccine, and the ability to easily go online in some instances and get an appointment, we have to take those additional steps to ensure that they are aware of its availability, they can get appointments, and that they understand that the vaccine is safe.
Let me ask you, I have a couple things. One's news of the day, but another one, there's a lot of day one promises right now.
Jen does news of the day.
Okay, fine. Let me ask you,
We'll do the whole thing after that.
on February 20th of last year, President Biden said, my first day of office, I'm going to send a bill to the Congress repealing the liability protection for gun manufacturers, closing the background check loopholes, and waiting period. So what happened to that day one promise?
Well, I think you've seen that we have rolled out an unprecedented number of early executive actions. And as you've heard Jen say, and many of my colleagues say, this is just the beginning. We have 1,454 more days left in President Biden's first term. And so give us a little something to do over the next few days.
Cecilia? Thanks, Jen. Thank you, Ambassador. A housekeeping question, if I may, and then a follow-up. Can you speak specifically to what this does as it relates to immigration and immigrants? Does this cover particularly the prisons and private prisons housing immigrants, undocumented immigrants, tens of thousands of whom are facing deportation in privately run prisons right now?
This order today applies to the Department of Justice run prisons. It is not, in this instance, applicable to those run by other agencies.
Not ICE, not anything like that. Okay, and then going back to January 6th and what we saw just a few weeks ago at the Capitol, when we saw people roaming that building carrying Confederate flags, wearing anti-Semitic shirts, we saw lawmakers in that group, we saw firefighters in that group, we saw military veterans in that group. What are you doing to address this issue of white nationalism? And how concerned are you about the threat of from some of these groups leading into this impeachment trial in 2 weeks?
Well, I think we have seen, and it's been plain for all Americans on their television sets, just how serious a problem we face from nationalists and white supremacists who have demonstrated willingness to resort to violence in some instances. And that is why the president has ordered the intelligence community to compile a comprehensive assessment of the nature of this threat and challenge and its origins and roots, and thus provide policymakers with inputs that will be very important to address this challenge. The National Security Council has set up a capacity within the NSC to focus on domestic violent extremism and to ensure that we are within the White House and within the interagency coordinating efforts to craft and implement policies that will address this. So we're taking it quite seriously.
And why doesn't this address the ICE private detentions?
It addresses the Department of Justice prisons in the first instance. It's silent on what may or may not transpire with ICE facilities. There was a Department of Justice Inspector General report in 2016 that underscored that private prisons funded by DOJ were less safe, less secure, and arguably less humane. This was the Obama-Biden administration took steps to end renewing of contracts for private prisons. Trump administration reversed that, and we're reestablishing it.
Go ahead. And I know we met this morning, but tell us your name again.
Mario Barker, Bloomberg News. Thank you, Ambassador Rice. Two questions. The first, what will the administration do to address the relationship between communities of color and police, particularly as part of the mass incarceration component? And then second question, Republican legislatures have signaled that they're going to look to roll back some of the voting procedures from the last election. We know that that's centered in some of those swing states and largely black and brown communities. What's the administration going to do about that as well?
Well, with respect to prisons, policing, the entire basket of very important criminal justice reform issues, this is something that we are committed to addressing, and we will have more to say on criminal justice in the coming weeks, including on matters related to policing. So please stay tuned for that. With respect to efforts to roll back the access to the ballot, this is something that I expect that the president will address in his remarks today. It's a matter of real concern because we ought to be in the business of encouraging and enabling all Americans who are eligible to vote to be able to vote. And that's why, we will continue to work with Congress on its various efforts to advance democratic reforms. There's legislation on the Hill that would move us in that direction, including restoring and revitalizing the Voting Rights Act.
Jonathan, you'll have to be the last one, but Susan will come back, I'm sure.
You gonna let me come
After
back?
Rice. We'll welcome you back. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador.